In the summer of 1990, the world watched in disbelief as tanks rolled across the scorching sands of the Persian Gulf. The roar of engines shattered the silence of dawn, and within hours, the tiny, oil-rich nation of Kuwait was swallowed by a much larger and hungrier neighbor, Iraq. At the heart of this invasion stood one man, Saddam Hussein, a dictator forged in the fires of war, now burdened by crushing debt and ambition that knew no limits. Just 2 years earlier, Iraq had emerged battered but unbroken from an 8-year conflict with Iran, a war that drained its treasury and cost more than 1 million lives. Yet, instead of rebuilding, Saddam sought a shortcut to power and prosperity. He pointed south to Kuwait, accusing it of stealing Iraq's soil through a method called slant drilling. Claiming the smaller nation had siphoned billions from beneath his borders, but behind the accusations lay something deeper, a craving for dominance, a desire to reshape the Middle East under his rule. Kuwait, a country smaller than the U.S. state of New Jersey, suddenly found itself standing in the path of a storm. Iraqi troops crossed the border before dawn on August 2, 1990. In just 2 days, they seized control of the capital. The world soil markets panicked. Prices soared, and a new crisis threatened to pull the planet into another global conflict. But while Saddam celebrated his victory, far away in Washington and Riyadh, another man was already drawing up a plan that would turn the tide of history. His name was General Norman Schwarzkopf, a commander who had survived Vietnam's chaos and emerged determined never to let another war spiral into a quagmire. He saw through Saddam's bravado and understood his fatal flaw: arrogance. Saddam believed the world would not dare to challenge him. Schwarzkopf intended to prove him wrong. Over the next few months, the largest military coalition since World War II would form under the United Nations flag. Armies from America, Britain, France, Egypt, and dozens of other nations assembled in the deserts of Saudi Arabia. Their mission was clear: liberate Kuwait and end Saddam's aggression. But the method, that would be Schwarzkopf's masterpiece, a maneuver so daring, so unexpected, that it would rewrite the rules of modern warfare. This is the untold story of Desert Storm's left hook, a strategy of deception, speed, and precision that crushed one of the world's largest armies in just 4 days. A story not just of war, but of intelligence, innovation, and the human will to outthink even the most formidable enemy. If you love uncovering the hidden moments that changed history, the strategies, the courage, the decisions that shaped our world, then you are in the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us as we explore one of the most astonishing victories in modern military history: the day Schwarzkopf outsmarted Saddam's million-man army. Kuwait's fall was as swift as it was shocking. In just 2 days, the Iraqi, one of the largest in the world, swept through the small nation with overwhelming force. The streets of Kuwait City fell silent under the weight of occupation. Its government fled into exile, and its oil fields, the lifeblood of its wealth, now burned under a new flag. To the watching world, this was not merely an invasion. It was a seismic event that threatened to redraw the political map of the Middle East. For Saddam Hussein, it was the culmination of years of frustration and pride. He had endured an exhausting war with Iran, a conflict that left his nation burdened with more than $80 billion in debt. The Gulf's smaller monarchies, once his financiers, now pressed for repayment. To Saddam, this was an insult. He believed that Iraq had blood for the Arab world, serving as a shield against Iranian expansion. In his, Kuwait owed him gratitude, not demands. But Saddam's reasoning went beyond emotion. He saw in Kuwait a solution to all his problems. By absorbing its vast oil reserves, he could erase Iraq's debt overnight and gain control of nearly 20% of the world's petroleum supply. That meant power, real, tangible power, the kind that could dictate prices, bend economies, and command respect from the West. In his, Iraq was destined to lead the Arab world, and Kuwait was simply the first step toward that destiny. What Saddam failed to anticipate, however, was how his bold gamble would be perceived beyond his borders. In Riyadh, the royal family of Saudi Arabia watched with growing dread. The Iraqi, flush with victory and battle-hardened from years of war, now stood at their doorstep. If Saddam could seize Kuwait in 48 hours, what would stop him from pushing a little further south into the Saudi oil fields, the largest in the world? That single question sent tremors through every capital from Washington to London. For the United States, the implications were enormous. With both Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil under his control, Saddam could effectively hold the global economy hostage. The oil crisis of the 1970s had already shown how fragile the world could be when Middle Eastern oil was threatened. Now, the prospect of a dictator controlling nearly a fifth of the planet's reserves was unthinkable. In the days that followed, images of burning oil wells and fleeing refugees filled television screens around the globe. The invasion was not just a military act. It was a direct assault on the post-Cold War order, a moment when the boundaries of international law were openly challenged. The United Nations condemned the invasion almost immediately, demanding an unconditional withdrawal. But Saddam remained defiant, declaring Kuwait the 19th province of Iraq. He believed his army, numbering over 1 million strong, was untouchable. He compared himself to the great conquerors of history, men who changed the world through fear and will. Yet beneath his confidence lay a dangerous misunderstanding of his opponent. Saddam believed the United States, scarred by the memory of Vietnam, lacked the stomach for another distant war. He assumed that America's dependence on oil would force it to negotiate rather than fight. It was a miscalculation that would cost him dearly, because while Saddam was looking south, another figure was quietly preparing to challenge him from the west. General Norman Schwarzkopf, newly appointed commander of U.S. and coalition forces, understood that the stakes were far greater than a single border dispute. To him, Saddam's aggression represented a test of whether the world's new order, an era meant to be free of territorial conquest, could endure its first major challenge. Schwarzkopf had seen what happens when wars are fought without clear purpose or unity. He had lived through the chaos of Vietnam, where politics muddied strategy and soldiers paid the price. He vowed that this time, it would be different. As coalition troops began to arrive in Saudi Arabia, the desert transformed into a staging ground for one of the largest military mobilizations in history. American aircraft filled the skies, and armored divisions stretched across the horizon like endless steel rivers. But even as the coalition built its strength, Schwarzkopf knew brute force alone would not be enough. Saddam's army was vast, well entrenched, and accustomed to fighting in the harsh conditions of the desert. A direct assault into Kuwait, cross minefields and defensive lines, would be a bloodbath. To win, Schwarzkopf needed not just soldiers but strategy. He began to study Saddam the way a chess player studies his rival, looking for patterns, for blind spots. What he saw was a man obsessed with control but trapped by his own assumptions. Saddam expected his enemies to think like he did, to come straight at him, to challenge him head-on, but Schwarzkopf had other ideas. He would make Saddam see what he wanted him to see. He would let him believe that the attack would come from the south, from the very direction the Iraqi defenses faced, while secretly preparing something far more daring. As political leaders debated sanctions and resolutions, Schwarzkopf was designing the operation that would become one of the most brilliant maneuvers in modern military history. The left hook. It was a plan that relied on deception, mobility, and the element of surprise. While the world watched the standoff between Iraq and the West grow ever more tense, the seeds of Saddam's downfall were already being sown beneath the desert sands. The occupation of Kuwait had given Saddam power beyond measure, but it had also placed him directly in the crosshairs of a coalition unlike any ever assembled before. His victory, so swift and decisive at first, would soon unravel with equal speed. And as the world would soon learn, control of oil and territory meant little when faced with an enemy who understood the battlefield not just as a place of combat, but as a stage for illusion. When the world seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos, a man named Norman Schwarzkopf emerged as the coalition's answer to Saddam's audacity. He was no stranger to war. The jungles of Vietnam had once been his proving ground, a place where he learned not only the brutality of combat, but also the psychology of leadership. Soldiers who served under him remembered his fierce discipline, but also his empathy, the rare balance of a commander who could command fear and respect in equal measure. When the United States and its allies began to assemble the largest military coalition since World War II, Schwarzkopf was chosen to lead it. Not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his understanding that wars are not only fought with bullets and bombs, but with perception, deception, and willpower. He knew the stakes were immense. Saddam's invasion of Kuwait was not simply an act of aggression. It was a strategic earthquake that threatened to destabilize the Middle East and shake the world economy. With nearly 1 million men under his command, Saddam had fortified Kuwait and southern Iraq with intricate defense lines, trenches, bunkers, and minefields stretching across the desert. His generals boasted that any attempt to dislodge them would turn into another Vietnam for the West, a prolonged and bloody quagmire that would drain resources and morale. But Schwarzkopf had other plans. He refused to fight the war Saddam wanted. He would design his own fast, psychological, and devastatingly efficient. His first step was patience. For months, the coalition launched an air campaign that systematically dismantled Iraq's communication networks, air defenses, and supply lines. Schwarzkopf watched carefully, noting how Saddam continued to fixate on Kuwait, expecting a frontal invasion. The Iraqi leader poured reinforcements into the south, convinced that the coalition would strike head-on through the most heavily fortified zones. But behind the scenes, Schwarzkopf was quietly orchestrating one of the most audacious military maneuvers in modern history. He called it the left hook. It was not just a tactical flanking move, it was psychological warfare on a grand scale. While Saddam's forces were bracing for a direct assault, Schwarzkopf planned to swing a massive coalition force, hundreds of thousands of troops, armored divisions, and support vehicles far to the west, through the vast and seemingly impassable desert. To the untrained eye, it appeared suicidal. The terrain was harsh, supply lines would stretch thin, and dust storms could obscure visibility. But Schwarzkopf's understanding of logistics, timing, and deception turned the impossible into the inevitable. He knew that surprise was more powerful than sheer numbers. The coalition's intelligence and air superiority allowed him to mask movements so effectively that even as columns of tanks and vehicles moved under the cover of night, Iraqi radar and scouts remained oblivious. Schwarzkopf's strategy relied not only on mobility but on confusion, creating the illusion that the main attack would come from the south while the real hammer would fall from the west. His command center buzzed with coded transmissions, radar feeds, and satellite imagery, each confirming that Saddam had taken the bait. The Iraqi army waited for an assault that would never come, at least not from the direction they expected. What made Schwarzkopf different was his ability to merge cold precision with human understanding. He often spoke of the psychology of warfare, knowing that breaking an enemy's spirit was as critical as breaking their lines. He encouraged creativity among his commanders, giving them the freedom to adapt and maneuver rather than rigidly follow scripts. He believed that wars were won not just by strategy, but by trust in leadership, trust in technology, and trust in the soldiers who carried out the mission. In Riyadh, where the coalition headquarters was based. Schwarzkopf appeared calm, even jovial, but behind that composure was a mind in constant motion. Every report, every satellite image, every intercepted communication was another piece of a vast puzzle. He had seen enough of war's chaos to know that even the best plans could falter. But his goal was clear: minimize casualties, end the occupation, and restore balance without turning the Middle East into a graveyard. He pushed for efficiency, speed, and surprise, insisting that victory must come not through prolonged attrition, but through overwhelming, coordinated force. As the final preparations for the ground assault began, Schwarzkopf's leadership became a study in contrasts. He was a man who commanded immense power, 500,000 coalition troops at his disposal, yet he carried the weight of responsibility for every life under his command. His orders were clear but measured, his tone resolute but never reckless. He knew that the coming days would define not only the outcome of the war, but the perception of American military might for decades to come. In those tense hours before the storm, as tanks lined up under a moonlit sky and the hum of aircraft filled the desert air, Schwarzkopf's calm determination inspired confidence across the ranks. The soldiers did not know every detail of his grand strategy, but they trusted him completely. To them, he was not just a general, he was the embodiment of purpose and precision. The man who had promised them that this war would not drag on like those before it. And as dawn approached, with the left hook poised to strike, Schwarzkopf stood at the heart of the coalition's might, ready to unleash a plan so bold and swift that it would change the course of modern warfare forever. The vast desert stretched endlessly before them, an ocean of sand shimmering under the relentless sun, concealing both danger and destiny. Beneath that still horizon, General Norman Schwarzkopf was preparing to outthink one of the largest standing armies in the world. On paper, Iraq's forces looked indomitable: over 500,000 soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a network of bunkers and artillery that transformed Kuwait's borders into a fortress. They had dug deep into defensive positions, convinced that their numbers and terrain would bleed any invading force dry. But Schwarzkopf knew something Saddam Hussein did not. Wars are not won by numbers alone, they are won by perception, timing, and the art of deception. From the very beginning, Schwarzkopf's mind worked like that of a chess master. Every move had to mislead the opponent, forcing Saddam's generals to see what he wanted them to see and ignore what he needed them to miss. The Iraqi high command believed that a direct assault from the south across the heavily mined border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait was inevitable. It was the most logical route, and logic was precisely what Schwarzkopf intended to exploit. His plan was simple in concept but audacious in scale. Make Iraq believe the main attack would come head-on, while secretly preparing to deliver a devastating blow from the west, where the enemy least expected. To set the trap, Schwarzkopf orchestrated one of the most intricate deception operations in modern warfare. Coalition forces began conducting visible military exercises near the Kuwaiti border, drawing Iraqi attention toward the south. Tanks and armored vehicles were moved conspicuously along known routes, their dust clouds rising like deliberate signals to enemy observers. Engineers built fake camps and dummy equipment, rubber tanks, plywood aircraft, and even artificial heat signatures to convince Iraqi reconnaissance that a massive frontal invasion was imminent. Radio traffic was deliberately manipulated, filled with misleading orders and fabricated coordinates. To the Iraqi intelligence network, it appeared that Schwarzkopf was preparing to hurl his might directly into Kuwait's most fortified defenses. Meanwhile, under the cover of darkness and aided by superior air control, the true heart of the coalition's offensive quietly shifted westward. Thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery, supply convoys moved through the open desert, far beyond the range of Iraqi scouts. The logistics of this movement were staggering. tens of thousands of troops navigating featureless terrain, guided only by satellites, compasses, and unwavering discipline. It was a feat of coordination that few armies in history could have managed. Yet Schwarzkopf made it look effortless. Every mile they advanced westward placed them closer to Iraq's unprotected flank. And every day Saddam's generals remained convinced that the storm would strike from the south. The deception was working perfectly. Iraqi commanders continued to reinforce their southern lines, positioning elite Republican Guard divisions to meet a phantom assault. They dug trenches, planted mines, and prepared artillery for a confrontation that would never come. Saddam's military machine, vought rigid, could not adapt to uncertainty. They were prepared to repel a frontal assault, but they were blind to the shadows forming on their western horizon. Schwarzkopf's genius lay not only in planning but in understanding the psychology of his opponent. He knew that Saddam's pride, his need to appear invincible, would make him slow to react. He knew that once the Iraqi leader committed his forces to defending the wrong front, the battle would already be won in spirit before it began in blood. In the command centers of Riyadh and Dhahran, the atmosphere was electric. Satellite feeds streamed across glowing screens, showing the steady progress of the left hook, the grand maneuver that would soon define Desert Storm. Schwarzkopf's subordinates, seasoned generals and young strategists alike, watched in awe as their commander turned theory into movement, deception into destiny. To the media and much of the world, the build-up appeared like any traditional military preparation. Few outside the inner circle understood that the real offensive would unfold hundreds of kilometers away from where the world's attention was focused. As the days passed, Schwarzkopf continued to tighten the noose. Air superiority allowed coalition jets to cripple Iraqi communications and supply routes, ensuring that by the time ground forces moved, the enemy would be disoriented and isolated. The general timed every element of the plan with surgical precision airstrikes. Electronic warfare. Troop maneuvers all converging toward one decisive moment. To those under his command, Schwarzkopf's confidence was contagious. He spoke not with bravado but with certainty, assuring his officers that when the ground war began, it would be swift, coordinated, and overwhelming. Then, at last, the moment arrived. In late February 1991, under a moonless sky, the coalition's great hidden arm, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of armored vehicles, pivoted eastward from the desert. The left hook was in motion. The Iraqi, still facing south and bracing for a direct onslaught, had no idea that an entire mechanized force was now sweeping behind them like a tidal wave. When the first contact came, it was not the slow, grinding battle Saddam had anticipated. It was a lightning strike. Coalition forces cut through Iraq's western flank with astonishing speed, overwhelming outposts before the defenders even realized the scale of the assault. Within hours, entire divisions were encircled. From the command center, Schwarzkopf watched as his strategy unfolded exactly as intended. Reports poured in, enemy units surrendering en masse, prisoners describing total confusion among Iraqi ranks. The deception had been absolute. While Saddam's generals scrambled to redeploy, it was already too late. The coalition's armored divisions were advancing faster than any military planner had predicted, severing escape routes and cutting through Iraq's defensive line like a blade through fabric. In that vast, silent desert where Saddam had once believed himself unassailable, Schwarzkopf's plan had turned the illusion of strength into the reality of collapse. It was more than a military maneuver, it was a masterclass in the art of psychological warfare, where misdirection and patience proved more lethal than firepower alone. And as the dust rose behind the advancing coalition columns, one truth became clear: the war would not be won by brute force, but by brilliance, the kind of brilliance that transformed a seemingly impossible campaign into one of the most decisive victories of the modern age. The desert had become a stage, and every grain of sand seemed complicit in Schwarzkopf's grand illusion. What Iraq's commanders saw through their binoculars, what they intercepted through radio signals, what their satellites reported back to Baghdad, all of it was part of a meticulously crafted lie. For weeks, the coalition executed one of the most elaborate deception operations in modern warfare. Fake radio chatter filled the airwaves, coded messages hinting at an impending attack from the Persian Gulf. Along the Saudi coastline, amphibious drills were staged in full view of Iraqi intelligence, complete with naval formations and landing craft rehearsals that looked convincingly real. Overhead, reconnaissance aircraft buzzed deliberately over the same locations, reinforcing the illusion that a massive seaborne invasion was about to unfold. On the ground, the illusion took on a life of its own. Entire battalions seemed to appear overnight, except they were not battalions at all. They were made of rubber, metal, and air. Inflatable tanks and trucks, painted in desert camouflage, were carefully placed in the open for Iraqi surveillance to detect. At night, engineers use heaters to simulate engine heat, fooling infrared scanners into thinking those fake vehicles were real. Dummy airfields, complete with plywood aircraft and fake radar signatures, extended the deception even further. To an Iraqi observer, it was impossible to distinguish illusion from reality. Every piece of misinformation led to the same conclusion. The coalition would attack directly from the south, through Kuwait's fortified front, in a frontal assault of attrition. Meanwhile, the true army, the beating heart of Schwarzkopf's strategy, moved in silence. 300,000 troops, a multinational force of Americans, British, French, and Arab allies, crept westward under the cover of darkness. They drove through uncharted desert, a sea of sand where the horizon was endless, and the only guide was the compass and the stars. It was an operation of breathtaking scale and precision. Columns of tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, and support vehicles advancing in tight formation, invisible to the enemy's eyes. Supply lines stretched behind them like arteries feeding a living organism, bringing fuel, water, and ammunition to the advancing front. Every step of this movement was a gamble against time and terrain. The desert was unforgiving. Its vastness could swallow a convoy whole. Yet Schwarzkopf's logistical command turned chaos into choreography. GPS technology, still relatively new at the time, became their silent ally. Convoy commanders navigated by satellite, ensuring that thousands of vehicles could traverse featureless wasteland without colliding or losing direction. The troops, hardened by months of preparation, said little as they drove, the roar of engines their only soundtrack. They knew they were part of something extraordinary, an invisible migration of steel and determination that would soon rewrite military history. Back in Baghdad, Saddam's generals remained fixated on the south. The deceptive operations had worked so flawlessly that every scrap of intelligence they received only confirmed their expectations. Reconnaissance photographs showed massive troop concentrations near the Kuwaiti border. Radio intercepts mentioned supply shortages in southern camps, further suggesting the strain of a coming offensive. Even U.S. naval movements in the Persian Gulf seemed to reinforce the illusion. Saddam was so certain of his own narrative that when advisors warned him of unusual coalition movements in the West, he dismissed them as impossible. "No one can move an army through that desert," he reportedly said. "They would die there before reaching us." And so, as the Iraqi military reinforced its southern defenses, digging trenches, laying mines, and positioning artillery, Schwarzkopf's left hook continued to swing wide and undetected. Coalition pilots flying high above the desert occasionally glimpsed the immense lines of vehicles below, crawling like ants across the sand, each one part of a colossal maneuver that the world would later call the miracle in the desert. But to those involved, it was less miracle and more meticulous human effort, countless soldiers and officers executing orders with discipline and silence, trusting in their commander's vision. At night, the desert transformed into a dark ocean. The troops switched to blackout conditions, driving with dim blue lights or none at all. The horizon glowed faintly from distant oil fires, remnants of earlier bombings, and the occasional flare from reconnaissance planes. Yet morale was high. Soldiers knew that every mile they covered undetected was another step closer to victory. In the command tents, officers studied satellite maps by the dim light of monitors, whispering updates as the columns advanced with clockwork precision. Schwarzkopf, monitoring from headquarters, was a man in control yet restless, aware that one error, one captured transmission, one stray patrol could unravel months of deception. The operation's brilliance lay in its balance between showmanship and silence. While the fake invasion roared with noise and spectacle, amphibious rehearsals, radio broadcasts, visible troop movements, the real offensive moved like a ghost across the desert floor. The contrast was poetic, illusion above the surface, reality below it. Schwarzkopf understood that modern warfare was not just about weapons, but about controlling information, manipulating the enemy's expectations until their confidence became their downfall. As the last convoys reached their staging positions, a sense of calm settled over the coalition's western flank. From there, they could look eastward toward Iraq's rear, undefended, exposed, and utterly unaware. The deception had bought them everything they needed: time, position, and the element of surprise. Schwarzkopf's gamble had paid off. The Iraqi, once so proud and certain, now sat waiting for an enemy that no longer existed in front of them. They were facing shadows while the real storm gathered behind their backs. The coalition's western divisions, now arrayed in full battle formation, were ready to strike with a ferocity and precision that would shock the world. In those final quiet hours before the attack, the soldiers could almost feel the weight of history pressing against them. The sand beneath their boots seemed to hum with anticipation. They had crossed a landscape that Saddam believed impassable, carried by a plan so audacious that it bordered on the impossible. But Schwarzkopf's genius had always been about turning the impossible into the inevitable. Soon, the silence of the desert would break not with the confusion of a desperate fight, but with the symphony of a perfectly executed strike. And when it came, the illusion that had fooled an entire army would vanish in an instant, replaced by the thunder of victory moving swiftly from the west. For centuries, armies had fought by instinct, compass, and chance. But in the winter of 1991, as the sands of the Arabian desert became the arena for one of the most sophisticated campaigns in modern history, the art of war itself was being rewritten. The coalition forces that gathered under Schwarzkopf's command were not only powerful, they were precise, guided by technologies that transformed warfare into something almost surgical. This was not just a test of men and machines, but of an entirely new era in military science, where steel and software would march together across the desert night. The Gulf War became the first conflict in which global positioning system, gas technology, played a central role. Before this, navigation across vast, featureless deserts had been the nightmare of every commander. The dunes shifted, the horizon gave no bearings, and the stars could vanish behind walls of dust. But now, for the first time, armored divisions and convoys could move with mathematical precision. Small piece receivers, devices no larger than a soldier's hand, guided entire battalions through darkness and storm. Tank commanders followed coordinates instead of landmarks. Pilots flew invisible routes across the night sky, and supply trucks traced invisible lines across the sand, converging exactly where Schwarzkopf's master plan required them to be. To the men on the ground, it felt almost supernatural. In previous wars, Navigation errors could scatter entire units or delay operations for hours. In the Gulf, they moved as if the desert itself had been mapped into obedience. Schwarzkopf as Grand Deception. The silent westward migration of 300,000 troops would have been impossible without this technology. The Iraqi, bound by outdated methods, had no idea that their enemies were not just advancing but calculating their advance to the meter. Every mile covered, every turn made, was logged with exactitude. When the time came to strike, there would be no confusion, no delay, no drift. Precision would become their greatest weapon. But GPS was only part of the revolution. Above the sleeping desert, stealth aircraft slipped through the night, unseen and unheard. The F-117 Nighthawk, with its faceted design and radar-absorbing surface, was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. It did not fight for air superiority in the traditional sense, it simply bypassed it. These aircraft flew deep into Iraqi territory, invisible to radar, striking command centers, communication hubs, and radar stations with chilling accuracy. Their presence was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Iraqi radar operators would see nothing, hear nothing, and then suddenly, their screens would go dark. The message was unmistakable. The coalition could reach anywhere, at any, and there was no defense against it. Meanwhile, the skies filled with other marvels of precision, the so-called smart weapons. Laser-guided bombs and precision-guided munitions replaced the carpet bombing of earlier wars. Pilots no longer dropped ordnance by guesswork. They guided it with pinpoint accuracy, following laser reflections or GPS coordinates all the way to their targets. Television cameras mounted on the bombs transmitted live footage of their descent, allowing operators to watch as a single weapon threaded through a window or struck the exact corner of a bunker. For those watching the footage on news broadcasts around the world, it looked unreal, like science fiction unfolding in real time. Yet for Schwarzkopf, it was the perfect embodiment of his doctrine: efficiency over excess, precision over destruction. The technological edge was not just a matter of superiority, it was a matter of philosophy. Schwarzkopf understood that every mistake, every misfire, could undermine the coalition's moral authority and global support. He was waging a war that had to be not only won but justified. Each precision strike sent a message of discipline and restraint. The coalition was not there to destroy. It was there to liberate, to restore balance. And the tools at his disposal made that possible on a scale that no commander before him could have imagined. In the command centers, the coordination between air and ground became a kind of digital symphony. Satellites relayed real-time imagery of the battlefield, while computers tracked unit positions and enemy movements. Schwarzkopf could look at his screens and see the entire war unfold like a living map, lines shifting, icons flashing, coordinates updating by the second. He could give an order in Riyadh, and within minutes, a pilot hundreds of miles away would adjust his course, or a tank battalion would alter its formation. The chaos of war had been replaced by a new kind of order, an invisible web, information linking soldiers, machines, and strategy into a single, unified force. To the Iraqi army, this was incomprehensible. They fought with outdated maps and radio communication easily intercepted or jammed. Their anti-aircraft guns fired blindly at an enemy they could not see. Their armored divisions immobilized by precision strikes that severed command links before they even understood where the attack was coming from. When the ground assault began, many Iraqi soldiers surrendered without firing a shot, disoriented not just by the bombs, but by the realization that they were facing an enemy operating on a different plane of existence. For the coalition troops, this sense of superiority came with awe as much as pride. They were witnessing history being written in real time. The soldiers who had trudged through the desert with their peace units knew they were part of something far larger than themselves, the first true demonstration of modern, Integrated warfare. For decades, military theorists had dreamed of such precision, and now it was here, unfolding under the relentless desert sun. And yet, behind all the technology and coordination, the human element still anchored everything. Schwarzkopf's leadership, his calm amid complexity, gave the entire operation its coherence. Machines could calculate, satellites could guide, and computers could predict, but it was human intuition that turned those tools into victory. He understood that even in an age of automation, wars were still fought by people, soldiers trusting their equipment, pilots trusting their instruments, and commanders trusting their vision. As the coalition's campaign moved toward its climax, the combination of deception, precision, and speed became unstoppable. The desert, once an obstacle, had become an ally. GPS-guided columns carved invisible pathways through emptiness. Stealth bombers erased defenses before they were even detected. Precision strikes dismantled an entire army with minimal resistance. The world watched in astonishment as Schwarzkopf's plan unfolded with clockwork perfection, proving that technology had not only changed the tools of war, it had changed its very nature. The Gulf War was more than a battle for Kuwait. It was a turning point in the story of human conflict, a moment when warfare stepped out of the age of attrition and into the age of information. And in that boundless desert, under the command of a general who understood both strategy and psychology, the future of military power was born quietly, efficiently, and with breathtaking precision. As dawn broke on February 24, 1991, the desert sky over the Arabian Peninsula shimmered with the faint glow of engines and the dust of 1,000 moving machines. For weeks, the Iraqi High Command had been fixated on the south, expecting an amphibious landing near Kuwait's coast, a deception the coalition had carefully orchestrated through fake radio chatter and decoy equipment. Yet, in that pale morning light, the real strike came not from the sea, but from the vast, unguarded west. What followed would become one of the most decisive and swift military maneuvers in modern history. Thousands of armored vehicles, tanks, and troop carriers surged forward, carving through the open desert in a sweeping left hook that would outflank and entrap Iraq's most powerful formations. The coalition's movement was not chaotic but choreographed with near-perfect precision. Guided by GPS technology, still a novelty at the time, units navigated across hundreds of miles of trackless terrain, arriving exactly where they were needed. Exactly when they were needed. This was not just warfare, it was a display of coordination and speed that left Iraqi defenses paralyzed. The ground trembled under the advance of M1 Abrams tanks, their engines humming steadily as they pushed through the sandstorms. Behind them, Bradley fighting vehicles and British Challengers moved in tight formation, their commanders constantly communicating through secure satellite links. To the Iraqis dug into static defensive lines, this massive western advance seemed to appear out of nowhere. Trenches, bunkers, and minefields that had been meticulously prepared for months now pointed the wrong way. The coalition's strike did not simply engage the enemy, it bypassed them entirely, cutting deep into the rear and shattering supply chains. Within hours, the battle lines that Saddam Hussein had built his confidence upon began to crumble. Iraqi units, isolated and confused, received contradictory orders from Baghdad. Some tried to retreat north toward Basra. Others attempted to hold their ground. But in the open desert, there was nowhere to hide. Coalition aircraft maintained constant air superiority, striking command posts and armored columns with precision-guided munitions. The sky above was a relentless storm of jet trails and tracer fire, but beneath it, the ground operation continued with methodical efficiency. Every move had been anticipated, every counterattack met with overwhelming force. By the second day, coalition forces had completed the encirclement, sealing off the main highway north, the infamous Highway of Death. Cut off from reinforcements and supplies, entire Iraqi divisions found themselves trapped. Some surrendered in droves, stepping out of their trenches with white flags or improvised cloths. Others tried to fight on, but morale had collapsed. For them, the war had turned from strategy into survival. Coalition soldiers, many of them young and thousands of miles from home, found themselves capturing entire battalions without firing a shot. It was a strange, almost surreal end to a war that had begun with such high tension and global fear. As night fell on the fourth day, the battlefield was eerily quiet. Communication lines buzzed with reports of Iraqi units withdrawing or surrendering. Commanders verified the unimaginable major combat operations were effectively over. In just 100 hours, the Iraqi, once considered one of the largest and most experienced in the Middle East, had disintegrated. The numbers were staggering: more than 30,000 troops lost, thousands of armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned, and countless soldiers captured. Yet, beyond those figures lay something deeper: the realization that the nature of warfare had changed forever. The coalition's swift victory was not solely due to superior firepower, but to technology, coordination, and information. Every tank movement, every bombing run, every logistic resupply had been part of a synchronized system that functioned almost flawlessly. It was the first true test of modern, networked warfare, where intelligence and timing mattered as much as courage and firepower. And in those 100 hours, the world saw what such precision could accomplish. But victory brought reflection as well. The speed and decisiveness of the campaign left many wondering if the war's end had come too easily, if deeper conflicts still lingered beneath the surface. For the soldiers who took part, the memory of those 4 days would remain vivid: the relentless march through dust and fire, the eerie silence after the final ceasefire, and the sight of a once proud army brought to its knees not through attrition, but through overwhelming control of the battlefield. When the guns finally fell silent, the world stood in awe of what had just unfolded. The Gulf War had not only redrawn the geopolitical map of the Middle East, but had introduced a new era in military history, an era where precision, deception, and speed defined victory. And though it ended swiftly, its lessons would echo for decades, shaping how nations would fight, plan, and prepare for the conflicts yet to come. When the dust finally settled over the Kuwaiti desert, the silence felt almost unreal. After weeks of airstrikes and months of preparation, the ground war had lasted only 4 days, just 100 hours from the first armored thrust to the final ceasefire. In that brief span, General Norman Schwarzkopf's plan had unfolded with a precision that astonished even those who executed it. The left hook strategy, deceptive, swift, and devastating, became an instant textbook example of modern warfare. It proved that the future of battle was no longer about sheer numbers or attrition, but about speed, coordination, and technological dominance. Schwarzkopf's campaign was not just a victory, it was a revelation. Using deception on a scale unseen since World War II, he turned the battlefield into a stage of illusions. Fake radio chatter, dummy tanks, and staged naval drills had misled Iraq's command, convincing them to defend the wrong front. Meanwhile, the real strike, the massive armored sweep from the west, was executed with pinpoint accuracy. This operation did not just crush an army, it reshaped military thought worldwide. From Washington to Moscow, military strategists began rethinking everything they knew about war. The Gulf conflict showed that in the right hands, technology could make an army smarter, faster, and deadlier than ever before. For the U.S. and its allies, this victory marked a turning point. The use of stealth aircraft, GPS navigation, and precision-guided munitions had given the coalition an overwhelming edge. In previous wars, armies often fought blind, relying on maps, compasses, and human error. But now, soldiers navigated by satellite, struck targets from miles away, and coordinated across vast distances with real-time intelligence. It was the dawn of what would later be called network-centric warfare, where every tank, plane, and unit was part of a single connected system. The Gulf War became proof that information, when wielded with discipline, was as powerful as any weapon. Yet, behind the triumph, there was also reflection. The images that emerged from the battlefield, the burning oil fields, the wrecked convoys, and the human toll reminded the world that even a swift war leaves scars. Many soldiers spoke of the eerie quiet after the ceasefire, when the adrenaline faded and the cost of victory sank in. Others recalled the haunting sight of retreating forces caught in the chaos of the final hours. For them, it was not just a story of strategy and success. It was a story of endurance, fear, and the burden of witnessing history unfold in fire and sand. In Washington, the Gulf War was hailed as a defining moment for the U.S. military. It restored confidence after the long shadow of Vietnam and showcased a new kind of American power, precise, professional, and technologically unmatched. The phrase shock and awe had not been coined yet, but its essence was already visible in the way the coalition fought. Nations around the world took note. Wars of the future would be fought not just by soldiers, but by engineers, scientists, and satellite operators. The battlefield had expanded beyond the front lines into the realm of data, surveillance, and global communication. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Gulf War was its demonstration of unity. 35 nations had come together under a single command, proving that collective resolve could overcome even the most complex challenges. It was a rare moment in history when political, moral, and strategic goals aligned so clearly. That unity, though fleeting, showed the world what cooperation could achieve when driven by shared purpose and precise execution. As the soldiers returned home, they carried with them stories of courage and transformation. Some spoke of the camaraderie forged under the desert sun, others of the strange stillness after the storm. And while the headlines celebrated the speed and scale of victory, many veterans quietly reflected on what it meant to have witnessed the future of war firsthand. They had seen how intelligence, technology, and discipline could change everything, and how, even in triumph, war remained a solemn endeavor. Today, decades later, the lessons of 1991 continue to echo through military academies and strategic circles. The Gulf War became not just a chapter in history, but a foundation for everything that followed, from the digital revolution in defense to the precision doctrines that define modern armies. It was a war that ended quickly but changed warfare forever, proving that innovation and coordination could rewrite the rules of conflict. And as we look back on those 100 hours, we remember more than just a victory. We remember a moment when human ingenuity met technological evolution, a moment that transformed the desert into a proving ground for the future. The Gulf War was not merely fought. It was engineered, orchestrated, and executed with a precision that still inspires awe. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most remarkable military operations of the modern era. If you found this story compelling, insightful, or thought-provoking, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love exploring the turning points of history. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that shaped our world and the lessons they still hold today.